Well, hello, everybody. My name is Roy Richard Grinker, and I'm the organizer of this symposium today on the really fascinating, complicated, and contradictory experiences of Korean adoptees, Koreans in the diaspora. This is our annual signature conference at the George Washington University Institute for Korean Studies. And I would just like to say a few words about the Institute before we move on to the formal presentations. It's been a long time coming that we have our own institute. Professor Young-ki Kim Renaud, Professor Emerita at George Washington University, worked tirelessly over many decades to build Korean studies at GW. And we finally got an Institute for Korean Studies. Professor Ji-Soo Kim took the helm. She's Foundation Associate Professor of History, Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. And she, along with our Deputy Director, Greg Brzezinski, who's a Professor of History and International Affairs at GW and serves as Deputy Director, have been building a diversity of programs and activities. Our mission is to consolidate, to strengthen, to grow existing Korean studies at GW, but also to be more of a hub for the greater DC area. We have started doing this with the generous support of the Han Moo-suk Endowment. Han Moo-suk is the mother of famous author and mother of Professor Young-ki Kim Renaud. And for the last 24, 25 years, we've had the Han Moo-suk Colloquium, which is a really important element of Korean studies in the DC area because so much of what happens in the DC area is focused on politics, defense, and things of that sort related to the State Department and so on. And so having a colloquium that dealt with the humanities and the social sciences and the arts was really vital. And now we have opportunities to have other activities as well. The Institute, with the support of the Academy of Korean Studies, or AKS, now runs this annual signature conference, of which this is a part. But we also run research fellowships, and we give language fellowships, and we give a Korean language and culture student prize. We collaborate with Indiana University's Korean Studies to do a student conference for our outstanding students. We have visiting scholars. We have a publication series, and now the Journal of Korean Studies, which is edited by Professor Kim, is housed here at the GW Institute for Korean Studies. So I am really delighted to welcome you all here, to welcome you to virtually to the nation's capital, and to work on such a fascinating topic. You're going to hear about a whole host of issues, current and historical, on Koreans outside of Korea, Koreans who've returned to Korea, sometimes not with their own desire to return if there is deportation. You're going to hear about the concept of Koreanness. We will cover some issues on LGBT movements and other areas of difference. And you'll learn about transnational adoption and see the incredibly fascinating and moving film by filmmaker Sunhee Engelstoft, who will be screening that film here. We will continue now with a presentation by Dr. Susie Woo. Susie Woo is Associate Professor of American Studies at California State University, Fullerton. She received an MA in Asian American Studies from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a PhD in American Studies from Yale University. Her book, Framed by War, Korean Children and Women at the Crossroads of U.S. Empire, published by New York University Press, traces how Korean children and women became central to U.S. involvement in the peninsula during and after the Korean War. Thank you, Susie, for being here. We're really excited about your presentation, Korean Transnational Adoptions, Historical Contexts. We're honored to have you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. A special thank you to Richard Grinker and to Min-Hae Kim and to everyone at the Institute for making this panel possible. And Todd, I'm so excited by the research that you're doing, and I can't wait to talk to you more about it. I have so many questions, but I'll wait on that. And so it's a great honor to be on this panel with Todd and with Alina and Sunny as well. So thank you so much. My talk is going to focus on the historical origins of transnational adoptions from Korea, with the hope that this context can offer a foundation from which to understand the Korean adoptee diaspora today. By looking at the structures put in place at the outset of transnational adoptions from Korea and the cultural productions of Korean adoptees that left little room for experiences that were outside of assimilative narratives, we can see how the historical origins of Korean adoptions established, to use the words of the panel description, the vexed nature of transnational adoptions. I wanted to begin by taking us back to US military occupation of Korea. Between 1945 and 1948, when the US occupied South Korea, the US also became very involved in the social welfare of Korean citizens. During this period, the US spent well over $300 million on economic aid to Korea and administered these sweeping campaigns that included smallpox vaccinations and DDT dusting. The numerous agencies that included AFAC, or Armed Forces Assistance to Korea, and Korean Civil Assistance Commands, KCAC, and the United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency implemented these health practices to better manage the populace. But it was these structural foundations that set the precedent for the US military's involvement in the social welfare needs of Korean children during the war. As we all know, the Korean War took place between 1950 and 1953, and as we also know, it's still technically not over, as an armistice ended the fighting, but not the war. And this devastating war claimed an estimated 34,000 American, 900,000 Chinese, and well over 3 million Korean lives. Some estimate even closer to 4 million. And the majority of these were civilian deaths. While technically the United Nations fought in Korea, the United States made up 90% of all UN troops. The US dropped 635,000 tons of bombs on a peninsula which is the size of Minnesota, and entire cities were entirely wiped off the map. This level of US military violence in Korea deeply hampered American efforts to promote visions of democracy during the early Cold War. To allay domestic and international criticism, the US military and government made numerous efforts, one of which included the production of imagined family frames that positioned Americans as caregivers of Korean children in need. Part of this project entailed the bringing together of US military men and Korean children. And when I was looking at the records in the National Archives, I came across these Army chaplain daily logs of the activities of the servicemen who are stationed in Korea. And every day there was a point, almost every day, there was a point of contact where the men were scheduled to visit an orphanage, whether it was to bring donated goods or to have playtime with the kids. Around the holidays, the children at orphanages would often put on these Christmas productions for the American GIs. And these mandated interactions uplifted the spirits of American GIs and gave them a purpose in this war, but there were other reasons for this pairing. And this was made clear by the Department of Defense that sent cameramen to capture these tender moments and then supplied the footage to various news outlets. So the images that you see here on the slide are from a Universal newsreel from April of 1952. And the first half of the clip of news from Korea shows these images of American tanks and planes dropping bombs and crossing the 38th parallel. So these are a couple stills. And the second half shows this.
The goals were collected by the Marine Corps League in many American cities. And don't they go over with these Korean youngsters? With a new dress goes over just fine.
So this blend of military might and humanitarian aid were typical of the kinds of images that the DoD would film and that Americans would end up seeing in US media. This footage was edited to display powerful US war technology while simultaneously covering over the destruction caused by these very same machines. By showing how American GIs cared for Korean children, the US military was able to assuage some of the criticism they received for killing innocent Korean civilians during the war. For many Americans, this was their first introduction to Korea. Few knew about Korea until the war, and they were introduced to this country primarily through images like these that depicted Korean children in need of rescue. And layered into these stories of rescue were overt messages of Korea's political alliance with and support of the US military. The story of Jimmy Busan really illustrates this point. And so you see here, this is Kwon Sun-se, who lost his parents in the war and was reportedly found by 2 US Marines who described him as, quote, the little refugee that went straight to their hearts, end quote. They nicknamed him Jimmy Busan and brought him aboard the USS Whitehurst, where according to the Pacific Stars and Stripes, which was the US military newspaper, the Marines adopted the boy as their mascot and, quote, the bright-eyed Korean orphan adopted the Navy. The Department of Defense created a short film that showed the boy scrubbing the hull of the ship dressed in a Navy uniform tailored to fit. And this image is a still from the end of the film that shows Jimmy saluting in front of the American flag. The story was picked up by Stookie Allen, who was the cartoonist of the Keen Teen series in the United States that celebrated exemplary American teens. While Jimmy was not American and not white, like other teenagers spotlighted in this series, appeared in several newspapers throughout the US. He still embodied American ideals, and as you can see here, he, quote, hoped to be in America soon. In addition to constructing Korean children to be politically aligned with the US, they were purportedly culturally aligned as well. Images like this one that appeared in the National Geographic in May 1953 showed Korean children embracing American culture. And you would often see images of Korean children wearing cowboy boots. And here they're reading Roy Rogers, although they probably can't read the words in English, but it often showed them in these kinds of depictions. And often they were also depicted in miniaturized US military uniforms. These are the kind of images making their way to the US that communicated visions of Korean children who needed and also deserved help. There was an outpouring of American support for Korean children during and after the war. One of the most successful fundraising campaigns came in the form of the Korean Children's Choir, which was sponsored by the American Korean Foundation. In 1954, the choir children, who were all under the age of 12, toured across the United States, visiting 50 cities. They went on to raise $10 million for post-war recovery in Korea. And these children were really popular. They performed at the White House. You see them here performing at the Statue of Liberty. They were on the television game show Name That Tune. They also had a record to help with fundraising efforts. And they were also a source of pride for Korea. President Lee Syngman felt that unlike waif imagery that circulated during the war, the choir promoted a more positive image of Korean resilience. During the tour, it was continually emphasized that all of the children performing were double orphans who had lost both of their parents in the war. And many Americans tried to adopt them, but couldn't because there were no official protocols for transnational adoptions at that time. These kinds of wartime and post-war images produced ideas about Korean children in need who loved America, while also positioning Americans as their presumed rescuers. And so I should say there are so many stories about the Korean Children's Choir. There's stories about them eating hot dogs with gochujang, the hot pepper paste, and it was very much an East meets West kind of narrative that was, of course, a very Cold War cultural narrative. These preconceived notions about Korean children before they ever arrived to the United States served as a backdrop for Korean adoptees. It became a narrative used to encourage Americans to adopt from Korea while also setting the expectations placed upon Korean children once they arrived. Alongside these kinds of cultural representations of Korean children were structural changes that would come to facilitate adoptions. Orphanages that did not exist prior to the war suddenly cropped up and in great numbers. In 1952, it was estimated that there were about 317 orphanages, and most of these were run by US missionary organizations. In fact, by 1955, the Korean Ministry of Social Affairs only granted licenses to orphanages that showed proof of property and missionary support. By 1957, the majority of the 482 institutions that housed over 48,500 children were operated by Americans. And this might go to the question that was put in the chat about the history of US missionaries. So, the history of US Presbyterian and Methodist missionaries in Korea dates back to at least 1884, when the Korean embassy was first established. And these foreign missions, part of their proselytizing efforts was to build schools and hospitals as a way to gain the trust of local Koreans. And while their activities were curtailed during Japanese colonization between 1910 and 1945, it's with the arrival of the US military in 1945 that they gained a much stronger foothold in Korea. And so if we think about this and we think about the infrastructure that US missionaries had already built in Korea, and the fact that many of them were on the ground, you could see how it is that they dovetailed into kind of becoming synonymous with social welfare needs and of children during the war. The first transnational Korean adoptions happened during the war, and while the US military did not condone and oftentimes actually tried to stop its men who wanted to formally adopt Korean children, US servicemen navigated the red tape to bring Korean children to the United States. But it really wasn't until 1955 that several organizations began to more regularly administer Korean adoptions. And these organizations included Catholic Relief Services, Christian Children's Fund, Church World Service, Foster Parents Plan, and World Vision. But it was really the work of Christian evangelicals Harry and Bertha Holt that brought widespread attention to Korean adoptions and to mixed race children in particular. And so you'll see Harry and Bertha Holt here in the front of the bottom of the stairs. In 1955, the Holts adopted 8 mixed-race Korean children, and in 1956, they established the Holt Adoption Program. And the Holts worked really closely with President Rhee, who in 1953 ordered a directive to send, quote, all half-American children to the, quote, land of their fathers. In 1954, Rhee created the Child Placement Services, whose sole purpose was to send mixed-race children abroad for adoption. The confluence of these events, as well as an overwhelming number of US adoption advocates that pressured US Congress, resulted in a series of temporary transnational adoption laws in the 1950s. But it wouldn't be until 1961 that the US established its first permanent transnational adoption law. South Korea created a sister act, the Orphan Special Law, that same year. And this is really what opens the path to transnational adoptions from Korea to the United States. Between 1955 and 1966, 6,050 US families adopted Korean children. These are estimated numbers. There are different numbers when you look in different kinds of records. Of this group, an estimated 2,750 were Korean white and 800 were Korean black. While the majority of adoptees coming from Korea at this time were mixed race, US media centered primarily on quote-unquote full-blooded Korean children when sharing news of these overseas adoptions. So for example, here's a child who had appeared in war relief posters during the war. And in 1956, he was adopted by a white American widow in Los Angeles. And these are the images from Life magazine that shows him on his first day in the United States. And he's looking very American in his gingham shirt, and he's doing all of these American things like talking on the phone and watching television. And model narratives like these supplanted the trauma experienced by these children. It also did not address what the rest of their lives would look like in the United States, capturing instead the moment of arrival. These constructions of model Korean adoptees were essential to transnational and transracial adoption narratives. If we think about the 1950s in the United States, and the vision of the white heteronormative nuclear family, you can see how it was that the Korean child had to be made less foreign in order to make them more acceptable. They had to appear assimilable and eager to embrace American culture. And in case studies that I saw at the International Social Services, archives, when you see the child reports and the child studies, they paint a very different picture from these publicized stories. There are reports of children who are chanting that they want to go home to Korea. There are stories of children who are crying uncontrollably and cannot be consoled. A child who, quote unquote, refused to eat rice was interpreted as a sign of adjustment as opposed to a possible sign of homesickness. And in these ways, these model narratives about Korean adoptees didn't allow for the loss and trauma experienced by these children. Most of them had survived the war, where they lost either one or both parents, or were separated from them amidst the chaos of war, and now found themselves in a country far from Korea. In the 1950s and 60s, according to US media, the Korean child was presumed to be better off in America, and the focus became less on how the children were really doing, and more on how their arrival to the United States reflected upon the adoptive parents, and in particular the white mother, and America more broadly. This picture was drawn by an American woman who adopted 2 mixed-race children from Korea. And if you look at this illustration, you could see how the arrival of the children completes her nuclear family. So she has Papa, Mama, son, and daughter. And in this written text below the image of her home and of the land that they own, she describes how this land is a, quote, old Civil War woods that was once part of the Underground Railroad, thus suggesting that this woman's adoption of 2 mixed-race children from Korea continued in this tradition of saving people from racial oppression. This example shows how public narratives circulating in the US at this time shaped how adoptive parents understood their actions in clear Cold War terms. By creating international and interracial families through adoption, they work to secure democracy in domestic and now also global ways. You may also have noticed the storks, right, that are bringing the children from Korea, see Korea to America. This imagery that suggested this kind of magical production of family was common when it came to adoptions from Korea. Holt used to call his planes that he used to bring Korean children to the United States as stork planes. And the narrative of the stork allows for a complete disconnect from Korea, and for mixed race children, a disavowal of their Korean birth mothers. For the last part of my talk, I wanted to center upon mixed race adoptees. One of the topics the panel organizers asked us to consider was how Korean adoptees both complicated and altered the idea of Koreanness as a race characterized by homogeneity. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about this here. Mixed race adoptees who had US servicemen fathers and Korean mothers made up over 70% of adoptions from Korea in the 1950s, and some put this percentage even higher. In the 1950s, approximately 65%, or 2,350 of the total number of mixed-race children in Korea were sent primarily to the United States, but also to Europe, to several European countries and Australia. In Korea, patriarchal structures that organized family registries around a male head of the household rendered mixed-race children stateless. And because bloodlines and lineage governed social belonging and cultural acceptance in Korea, mixed-race children who were born out of wedlock were left without legal protections. I should also note that this precarity continued when adopted children arrived to the United States. In early Korean transnational adoptions, when non-quota visas were required to circumnavigate existing US laws that severely restricted immigration from Asia, this was achieved through private acts of Congress. And what many adoptive parents didn't realize or didn't follow through on was naturalizing their adopted child, or in some cases, even completing the legal adoption process once the child arrived to the United States. And this is one of the questions that came in, I think, prior to our panel gathering, but there was a question about the Child Citizenship Act of 2000. And this was an act that made it so that the adoptive families would not need to formally apply to naturalize or gain citizenship for their newly adopted child. That process was eliminated, although there were loopholes to this law. It only applied to adoptees who were under the age of 18 when they arrived. And so it did not apply retroactively to those adoptees who aged into adulthood before the Child Citizenship Act took effect. In the 1950s, given the US demand for Korean children, particularly those mixed with white, US missionaries and adoption administrators would often go searching for these children in camp towns. And according to Holt records, the wait list for Americans who are interested in adopting from Korea sometimes stretched over 1,000. I've seen some lists that number, close to 500 requests from California alone. And so in order to meet that demand, they would, administrators would sometimes follow mixed race children. They would go to camp towns, try and find a child, follow that child home to speak to the child's mother. They would often bring along translators to to speak to the Korean mothers. They would also oftentimes bring along photographs of happily placed mixed race children to convince the mothers to relinquish their children. And many Korean women did try to raise their children even amidst extreme discrimination. The women often hid and cared for their children as long as they could, which often meant that when they could no longer do so, the children were older, about 8 or 10 years old, which made separation that much harder. In addition to this coercion to remove mixed race children from their Korean mothers, the advent of transnational adoptions brought US racializing practices to South Korea. And there were two primary events that transferred US race-making and discriminatory practices in a systematic way to Korea. The first was the segregating policies of the US military during the occupation and war. And the second was a process that was utilized to manage the placement of mixed race children. To assure that Korean white children were placed with white couples and Korean Black children were placed with African American couples, the racial identity of mixed race Korean children had to be determined in Korea. US social welfare workers and missionaries working in Korean orphanages taught Korean administrators how to look for markers of Blackness in children. And this is how practices that were already used in the United States were brought to and implemented in Korea. This is a 1962 child report from Holt Adoption Agency, and similar forms were used in other wartime orphanages in South Korea. And if you see here, it included a spot for the administrator to describe the child's skin color, their complexion, in comparison with a picture. So these reports came with a photograph, and then they provided this line where the administrator could indicate whether the child appeared lighter in person or darker in person than the photograph that was attached. You could also see checkboxes for the administrator to denote the color and texture of the child's hair and the color of their eyes. In other orphanage forms that I saw, there were similar checkboxes where the administrator could note whether the child's skin was, quote, dark, medium dark, or light. Administrators were also instructed to inspect the nail beds and scrotums of infants to determine what color the child would become when older. Once the racial background of the child was determined, they would then be matched with prospective adoptive parents in the United States. It was easier to place Korean white children, and there were a number of reasons for this. First, there were structural barriers in the US that made it more difficult for Black couples to adopt from Korea. So for example, in 1956, International Social Services had received 80 letters from Black couples, but only 4 of these cases were approved that year. And the reasons for this varied, but included the fact that some state agencies refused to work with African Americans, some forbade Black couples from adopting internationally, and they made this very racist argument that African American children in America needed to be placed first before admitting foreign children who had quote unquote Black blood. Many agencies required adoptive women to be stay-at-home mothers, which was not possible for many Black married women who were 5 times more likely than white married women to work for wages. Factors like these resulted in a higher number of Korean Black children who remained in Korea. In 1955, the ratio of Korean white children to Korean Black children was 4 to 6. This fueled ideas in Korea that Korean Black children were unwanted or undesirable. These processes that began with the advent of transnational adoptions stigmatized mixed race children and would continue into the 1960s. In 1961, the US and South Korea conducted a joint study, and this survey was called the Handicapped Children Survey Report. And this was by far the largest social welfare study to date in Korea. The report was over 250 pages. It involved the work of 26,000 trained officials at all levels of the Republic of Korea government. And they distributed these surveys and interviewed 78,000 disabled children across South Korea. And in this report, there were three main categories. There was the quote unquote physically handicapped, mentally handicapped, and socially handicapped. The social handicap category was for mixed race children with American fathers. And if you look here, there's a spot here for the administrator to, or for the survey taker to indicate the skin color of the child as white, black, or other, and also the nationality of the father. But if you look here, this is for children born after 1945. So this is clearly for a certain kind of mixed race child. This is not a Korean Japanese mixed race child. This is a child who's mixed with a UN serviceman, but most likely an American father. And in the section at the very end, it asked for the protector's desire for the child. And three of these options did not exist in Korea prior to 1945. And these were institutionalization, adoption, and vocational training. And I consider these institutions, the institutions like orphanages and the practices like transnational adoptions that were connected to these areas as structural legacies of US imperialism in South Korea. As part of the study, there was a panel of experts that included American and Korean social workers who contributed these reports. And when it came to mixed race children, they shared the view that there would be no place for them in mainstream Korean society. The director of Seoul Juvenile Court, Judge Sun Young Kwon, wrote, quote, children born out of wedlock, including mixed race children, may be emotionally insecure and tense. Also, they may be impulsive and nervous with a defensive mechanism, which makes it hard for them to win friends, end quote. The judge concluded that these children were inclined to delinquency and an animosity that could lead to, quote, aggressiveness, or perhaps even murder, arson, or illicit love affairs, end quote. Ann Davison, who was a US social worker of the International Social Services Korea branch, wrote that mixed race children shared the, quote, insecurity that their parents made for them, end quote. And she suggested that the low class status of their mothers, coupled with the foreign father who abandoned them, made for a future of criminality, fueled by feelings of resentment should no one step in and intervene. In the end, US and Korean contributors to the study still felt that the best option for mixed race children was intercountry adoption, since there was no treatment or remedy for the circumstances of their birth. This study created a pathology around mixed race children and reaffirmed the adoption practices that were initially put in place as an emergency measure after the war. It also suggested that mixed race children were a problem that needed to be solved, rather than focusing on US and South Korean military sanctioned prostitution or Korean societal and legal discrimination against mixed race people. For mixed race children who remained in Korea, there were several programs that were developed. There were a few segregated schools near camp towns. So for example, like Yonghwa Kungmin Hakgyo was an English elementary school that enrolled 50 mixed race children in 1962. The Holt Institute in Ilsan, which was run by Molly Holt, who was the biological daughter of Harry and Bertha Holt, she ran this an institute just outside of Seoul, and it was primarily for mixed race children who could, for one reason or another, not be placed for adoption. And they learned vocational skills while they were housed at Ilsan. In the mid-1960s, 55% of the children at Ilsan were Korean Black children between the ages of 10 and 13. And while the Holts didn't consider institutionalization to be the best solution, they did share the conclusions of the 1961 survey that this population had few alternatives given the prejudice of Korean society. And there were also some integrated schools, the Eurasian Children Living as Indigenous Residents, or the ECLAIR program. They established integrated middle schools. And by 1964, the Korean Association of Voluntary Agencies, or KAVA, which included representatives from churches and other voluntary groups from the US and South Korea. And this was a group that specifically sought Korean solutions for Korean problems. They would only support the integrated programs for mixed race children. And they felt that this was a much better route than institutionalization and a way to increase the acceptance of mixed race individuals. But in the end, Korean social workers believed that it was, quote, beyond their abilities to successfully integrate mixed race people into Korean society. In 1968, the director of the Korean National Red Cross declared that the confluence of South Korean and US efforts to place mixed race children in American homes ultimately allowed the Korean public and government to dismiss their very existence, to practice a practice that foreclosed the possibility of their acceptance in Korea. One mixed race adoptee described Korean efforts to remove mixed race children via transnational adoptions as akin to ethnic cleansing. Well after President Ree's 1953 directive to send mixed race children to the land of their fathers, the South Korean government continued to make efforts to remove mixed race people. And these efforts weren't as overt, they were kind of under the radar. In the 1970s, there were these training programs that sent mixed race people overseas for employment. Mixed race individuals were exempted from military conscription, which is mandatory for all Korean males between the ages of 18 and 26 for 2 years. And the goal of this rule was to allow mixed race individuals to be able to leave the country before they were 18 years old. Today, there remains a significant population of mixed race people in Korea. The Korean Herald estimates that 40,000 mixed race children were born between 1955 and 1969. And mixed race people in Korea still speak about how they continue to face discrimination. One woman who was born in the 1960s describes the alienation and racism that she experienced growing up in South Korea. She describes how she was bullied at school, and she has a half brother who was Korean white, who was so severely bullied that he dropped out of school and ended up working in a factory. I wanted to end by noting that while mixed race children initially made up the majority of Korean transnational adoptions, once the immediate war crisis had subsided in 1959, full Korean children became the primary focus of overseas adoptions. And going into the 1960s, the effects of rapid industrialization increased the number of transnational adoptions of Korean children. So, there are many reasons for this, but under the militarized rule of Park Chung-hee from 1963 to 1979, there was a 7.5 times increase in the female workforce. And workplace assaults became common and contributed to the growing number of children born out of wedlock. There were issues of poverty and the inability to care for children in this, because the system of transnational adoption was already put in place as the quote unquote solution for these kinds of child welfare problems. This is how the process of transnational adoption continues. There are now well over 150,000 Korean adoptees in the US and over 50,000 in European countries. And more recently, the ROK government has proposed to reduce the number of transnational adoptions. And there were also several reasons for this, one of which happened during the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, when North Korea accused South Korea of exporting its babies. This public criticism pushed the South Korean government to curb transnational adoptions. So in the 1990s, there were around 2,500 transnational adoptions per year. By the late 2000s, there were around 1,000 per year, and today the number hovers in the hundreds annually. Koreans historically didn't acknowledge adoptees, and because adoptees embodied the shame of a nation who could not care for their own. More recently, as the terrific work of scholars like Alina Kim, who is on this panel, returned, as many scholars are speaking to, there are these return tours that have offered Korean adoptees a chance to build communities. But these are also nationalist efforts that serve as an extension of the South Korean state. So I hope that this history helps us recognize just how transformative the work of Korean adoptees are today. Korean adoptee researchers, artists, writers, and filmmakers like Cindy Engelstoft, whose film we'll be watching later on, are foregrounding the conversations about their lives and daily experiences and rewriting a past and present that has historically been written over. And I strongly feel that Korean adoptee communities are cultivating this global network on their own terms that are redefining rote notions of kinship and nation along the way.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. Your presentation, along with Dr. Henry's presentation, offered such a great historical perspective for us. There are questions in the Q&A panel, and some you could answer by text. But I will go ahead and ask you a couple of questions. Can you see them?
I'm getting them right now. Okay.
Okay. Well, one question is, how did the mixed race adoptees get around the ban on Asian immigration? And did the U.S. and media focus on mono-ethnic Koreans in coverage result from, sensitivity that somehow mixed race children would symbolize a kind of empire or colonization?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the beginning, before the permanent laws were put in place, many of the people who brought over Korean children were receiving a special act of Congress on a case-by-case basis. When it came to mixed race adoptees, especially with the HALT adoption program, they were bringing these children in via proxy. And so they were cutting some corners in terms of coming to the United States. And so that is, they did have to navigate around this, the U.S. restrictive immigration laws that were in place at the time. Because the quota at that time, I think, allowed for up to 100 people to come from Korea. And obviously these numbers exceeded that. And so they required these special acts of Congress. And then did the U.S. press state focus on mono? I think that in part, so when I said that there were these adoptee activists and adoptee proponents and also the prospective adoptive parents, they were really pushing Congress to pass these laws so that they would be able to bring these children from Korea. And one of the public arguments that they made often was that this was America's responsibility when it came to mixed race children, and how it was American men who should be responsible for these children. And there was a focus, right? A spotlight was put on these failures of the U.S. military and the problems of U.S. servicemen in particular. And so that narrative, I think, made it a little trickier to highlight. There were definitely stories of mixed race Korean adoptees in the press. But from what I've seen, the majority of the stories that you see in mainstream publications like Life and Saturday Evening Post, and they often focus on the quote unquote full Korean children. And this was a less complicated narrative. And I think that it served the purposes of the Cold War cultural needs of the United States at this time better than the mixed race child who complicated that narrative of rescue that was so bound up in these stories of Korean adoptions at this time.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question that kind of dovetails with your last comments about the declining adoption, transnational adoption rate. Marie asks if you could comment on what you think the future of international adoptions in Korea is, particularly when the birth rate in Korea has been dropping rapidly.
Yeah, thanks for the great question. I think that the pattern has been to reduce transnational adoptions from Korea. And I think that number we'll have to see. It's taking some time, but I think that the numbers will, they've been steadily dropping over the decades. And I think that pattern will likely continue. And yeah, I don't know exactly, but my guess would be that number will keep coming down.
Are you aware, to go to another question that was posted, of different patterns showing differences in how mixed race Korean and mono-ethnic Korean adoptees did in terms of assimilating? The word that the questioner says is in terms of assimilating and growing up in the US, considering their biological and identity difference.
I think that there's so much work that's being done by Korean adoptees, especially in terms of interviews and oral histories of adoptee experiences. And so I can't speak to that directly. There might be others, maybe Alina might have some thoughts on this in terms of their experiences. I mean, from when I initially started this book project, it was going to be a collection of oral histories. And so I had reached out to people who had come to the United States as adoptees in the 1950s and 60s. And many of the 5 responses that I got immediately before I switched gears, there were several of the individuals who are now in their 60s, they were speaking about how they, this is a really difficult part of their past that they didn't feel comfortable speaking about, and how they weren't really given an option but to assimilate. There were two in particular who said, I'm just American through and through because that's the only option that was really presented to me. And so I think about that in terms of the early adoptees who came in the 50s and 60s, about how they weren't really presented with other kinds of opportunities or options. But I would, definitely suggest going to the work of Korean adoptees today who are collecting these stories and these oral histories of adoptee perspectives.
Well, thank you so much. And you can answer the other questions at your discretion online, and they will be, your answers will be seen. You can answer them live. So thank you again, and we'll now move on to our next presenter. I want to introduce Sun-hee Engelstoft, who's a documentary director, filmmaker in Copenhagen, born in Busan, and adopted to Denmark. She's attended several schools for photography and went to the prestigious National Film School of Denmark. The film you're going to see, Forget Me Not, is her debut feature-length documentary, which has already gained international attention at Sheffield Doc Fest, IDFA, the DMZ International Documentary Film Festival in Korea. And I really couldn't be more excited about seeing a film right now that has been done on the topic of women, girls, reproduction in South Korea. And I will pass the baton over to her. Thank you so much for being here, and we're honored that you have permitted us to screen your film.
Hi, and thank you so much for the invitation for this conference. I feel super honored to be in your presence. I'll just try and go straight into. I have a small talk before the film. It's very short. I'll just state a few things about the film. Forget Me Not is a feature-length documentary. It is my debut, as you said, and it's a Danish-Korean co-production. It premiered at Copenhagen Docs in Denmark in 2019, and it's about to have its cinema release in Korea this May. When I started this project straight out of film school, I thought that it would take around 2 years, roughly. It ended up taking 8 years. The process of making this film changed my view on international adoption from South Korea and made me question everything else I was told about it. So it has, of course, been a very interesting and difficult and tough journey. This project was not possible if I wasn't in close contact with the global Korean adoptee community and the progressive studies made and shared in those circles. After the screening, I will speak a little more and I'll be happy to answer questions. So I have a little statement. My official name is Sun-hee Engelstoft. This name I have given myself. Before that, I was Lisbeth Engelstoft. And before that, I was Shin Sun-hee with the number K82C150. I don't know when I'm born. I don't know who gave me my name. I don't know who my parents are and who I'm related to. I don't know the medical history in my family, and I don't know if I will ever reconnect with anyone from my family or know the story of my origin. My different names and numbers illustrate the different identities I've gone through and all the things I don't know about myself. And wherever I turned, I couldn't get any answers. This is why I needed to know more and seek information that started the journey, which ended up being the documentary that you're about to see, Forget Me Not. I was born in Busan in 1982, sent to Namkwang orphanage the day I was born, and adopted to Denmark through Holt International when I was 4 months old. I grew up as an only child with my 2 white parents in the countryside. Any other person of color that I would encounter in Denmark for the first 15 years of my life would have been someone internationally adopted. I grew up with being told from my adopted parents that I was given from my mother as an act of love, that my biological mother wanted the best for me, and so she had given me away. For the first 20 years of my life, I never questioned this. It wasn't until I went to South Korea several times in my 20s and also attended the first IKAA gathering in Seoul with the delegation from the Danish association, Koreaklubben, that I was exposed to different perspectives on international adoption and really truly understood that I, as an individual, would never have been able to accumulate this much information about international adoption and the consequences of it without the collective work of the global adoptee community. I remember experiencing Korean women demonstrating in the streets in 2004 that they had their children stolen from them by adoption agencies. And I learned by accident that South Korea had institutions for pregnant women because I was on a motherland tour that had arranged a small field trip, which ended up at such a home run by Catholic nuns. There I met an 8 months pregnant woman who came over to me and asked me directly, "Are you happy to be adopted?" I didn't know what to answer her. First of all, no one ever asked me that. Secondly, her underlying question was, is it okay for me to give my baby up for adoption? I had no good answer for her, but it changed my perspective from the narrative in which I grew up with. I suddenly understood that my identity issues were questions that were connected to other people than myself, to my mothers and their circumstances. I had to look elsewhere and outside of our adoptee community to find answers about adoption. So yes, I mean, this is the basis and the set off for me starting the project from personal experiences. And it has been a long journey, and I hope you will maybe have some questions afterwards. And I hope you'll enjoy the film. That might not be the right word, but I hope you'll stick with it. So thank you.
That was quite an experience, Sunhee. I don't know what to say after seeing that. It was so intimate and powerful, and you just captured the vulnerability, the powerlessness, the ambivalence, all of those complicated things that are happening to these girls, women, and your own presence in the film is extraordinary because there's never a moment in which you're obtrusive, but there's never a moment in which you're a completely detached filmmaker either. You know, when you put down the camera to hug that person, I mean, that was an extraordinary moment in the film for me. It was, and I don't even know how to describe it. So anyway, I thank you so much for such a beautiful, sad, heartbreaking film. It's an amazing achievement. So I am in this odd position where I don't know what to say because I'm just kind of overwhelmed emotionally by the film. I guess, you know, people may have some questions. There are certainly some. Can you talk a little bit about the difficulty or the challenges of making a film that involved your own experience as well as the experiences of others? Because it was just so masterful the way you wove together what you were filming, but what you were saying about yourself as well.
I mean, it's been a long process, and I didn't know the things that I know now when I started out. And I started out as just being very centered around that question, how a mother can relinquish her child. And it became such an odd thing for me the older that I got. So I guess that was just like the initial question, that where everything just started. And so it was from an extremely personal viewpoint. I mean, there's nothing special about my adoption story. So, I mean, if I'm one out of at least 200,000 Korean adoptees, then this is everyone's story. And I guess that, I mean, these are just 3 examples of how a woman can lose her child, and I never in my wildest dreams thought that that was going to happen. I mean, every time I started filming somebody and following her, it was with the intention of seeing her succeed in keeping her child. That was the story that I could morally, ethically, try and pursue. And that was also what I wanted to see. I wanted to see how they could do that. And I know that happens, but every time I started following somebody, then it didn't go that way. So it's also just like a specific time and place. I think it's a different situation with the shelters right now. I think at the time when I did my research in 11 and 12, there were over 50 institutions for women. And over half of the shelters were run by adoption agencies. And they were, of course, famous in rejecting taking women into their shelters if they wanted to keep their baby. So I have conducted quite a lot of research and interviewed a lot of different women stating these things. So it was also just to find a right way to tell a story where I could even just like be and have some time at one place. So I tried to get into some of the facilities and visited them, the adoption agency run facilities, mainly Hold, because that's where I'm adopted through. And that was just so impossible. And the attitude towards me as an adoptee, but also towards the women, was really, really hostile. Yeah, and then I had to find another facility, somebody that was independently run, some place where they actually believed and tried to give the women a fair choice. And so it wasn't before I met Mrs. M at SO1 shelter down on Jeju that I mean, when I arrived, then she said, like, I've been waiting for somebody like you to document this or to tell the stories of these women, because this was what she was doing, and she'd been doing that for quite a while, and she had encountered a lot of adoptees before, and she knew that she understood the link between adoptees and the mothers, and how they could sort of benefit from exchanging experiences and, kind of myth busting in a way, because there's so many narratives going on, like the dreamy future of sending your child to a Western country. And I mean, even one of the women who is more of a bi character in the film, she's like, she's doubting that. I mean, she's saying like, my baby could have gone to parents who were so much better, you know, money wise, or you know, all these things. So yeah, that I think that's another thing that I really discovered, that I thought from the beginning that there was just like one time that you would decide, okay, I'm going to give my baby up for adoption, and then that's it. But that doesn't happen that way. I mean, it's a question that they deal with every single day. And if you have a bad day as a single mom, a single parent, then I'm pretty sure that many people will sign on to, you know, then you can, then that guilt of not believing that you're good enough as a parent make you do these radical things. And if other people and authorities are stating these things, that you're not going to be a good enough parent, then of course you will try and believe something else, or be guilty to even have your child and hold on to your child. Another thing is that women of all ages came to the facility. I think that maybe I was drawn to young women that was younger, because my mom was 19 when she gave me up for adoption. So that was, but it was also just like a coincidence and a personality thing, which became, you know, quite a difficult thing, because can you keep your child? Do you have custody of your own child if you're a minor? And in Korean law, you do have a say. I mean, it is your choice to give it up for adoption or keep it. But of course, they were very young and very dependent on their families. But that was also the pattern that I saw on women who were much older. Yeah.
I wonder if panelists
yeah, sure,
have comments or questions for you. You can unmute yourself. You can raise your hand. If there's something you wanted to add to the discussion.
Sunny, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing this with us. I don't even know if I can speak right now, because I've been such a mess this entire time thinking about this. But you know, you do this incredibly beautiful job of really showing the mothers and really showing what their perspectives are. And I had the same, when you described what you thought was going to happen, I had that same, hope as well. And you really, really see how they aren't given options. These possibilities that we as the viewer, hold on to are foreclosed for these girls. And I think about so many things. So the two things that I wanted to say is that, I had seen in all of the documents, these stories of, mothers who have agreed, this is in the 50s and early 60s, to relinquish their child. And then they disappear. There are moments where the mother will disappear, but leave the child, or moments when the mother disappears with the child. That one, I didn't see that case very often. But the anguish that is involved in these choices, or, is something that you can't see in a record. You could really only see the way that you've allowed us to, and the way that these girls have allowed us to see what that process is really like. And I was thinking a lot about photographs and your use of photographs. Well, gosh, I have too many things to say. Okay, I'm going to limit it. One thing that I wanted to say is that when we think about structures of how the structures of transnational adoptions from its origins moment that I was speaking about, you could see how it has these processes have absolutely transferred over. The speed with which the adoptive administrators remove the one mother's child to take the child to the airport, like how quickly and how disorienting that is, it was shocking to see. And I can't help but feel like these are strategies that have now been employed for so many years by these organizations, that this is now a process that's built into it because they know that there will be wavering, and to again foreclose that opportunity for the mother to change her mind, they literally change the timing of things. And that to me was really stunning and so disturbing to see. And the other thing that really struck me is how you use photographs, and how photographs are in this whole film, is about memory and reconstructing memory and what memory might mean for the mother. That part where they talk about how the photographs, why would you want to have these maternity photographs taken? Because it's going to be evidence. And that's not at all why she was taking the photographs. I mean, all of these disjunctures about, about personal memory and about photographs. I mean, the photographs that you included of your adoptive family, I think waiting for you, all of these different narratives that are tied into these, these physical photographs. I thought that was a really it just made me think about so many things. So I'm going to stop talking, but I have so much more to say, but just thank you so much for allowing us to watch this film.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think there is, going deeper into the processes of how a child is relinquished and the conditions of that, and then comparing that, like comparing notes, comparing like all of the amount of different cases for adoptees. I mean, I'm still uncovering the same sheets of papers that I've had, for as long as I know, because there was nobody who wanted to, tell me what was in them. And I'm sort of, Mrs. M was one of the persons that was actually telling me what was in it. So I discovered during this process that my mom, she signed the papers for my adoption before I was born. And at the time that was even illegal in Korea. So, and there's nobody accountable for that. And nobody in Denmark, nobody in Korea. And so it's still like really, really difficult to obtain this information. And of course, I was shocked to know that this is happening right now. It's still happening. It's still going on. And I am now like a firm believer that it should really stop. This is not a practice that should continue. And I guess, there's so many factors, the birth rate is extremely low. It's such a wealthy country. They should build on their infrastructure. Their own population is their most valuable asset as a nation. And it's pretty simple. Another quick thing I just want to mention is that I also had an idea that my mother was the only one to make a choice. And this was really an eye-opener for finding out that it's not about 200,000 babies who were adopted abroad. It's concerning 200,000 families. So imagine how scary that is, that you are part of a family and somebody gives birth to a child, and then that child disappears, and nobody really talks about how that happened or what happened. And I struggle to find out, like, how do you as a family heal from that? So it's not just the women or the immediate family. It's also institutions, it's teachers, it's doctors, it's hospitals, it's social workers. Co-workers. I mean, it's a lot of people. It's a collective trauma. So that also made me think about the whole thing in a very different way, in a much more structural way. Yeah, it's also been really, really awkward to come back to Denmark and to sit on this knowledge and then try and reveal it with all of that personal discrepancy. I don't even know how to put it, but I mean, to face my adoptive mother and tell her that there was a crime that took place against my biological mother, my Korean mother, my initial mother, and to tell her that. And I have to be the messenger for that. And nobody really wants to take responsibility for that. And I mean, she's been my mother most of my life. And I love her very dearly. And it puts everyone in a really, really bad situation. So I really, really think it needs to stop. And all of the money involved with it is very problematic. I mean, it's pretty clear to me.
Sunhee, I would like to just read a couple of comments that are here. The film is so sad but touching and impressive, complicated feeling. Thank you for the screening time. Here's another comment. Thank you so much, Sunhee, for this work. As an adoptee from the 1980s, I don't think I've ever felt so personally seen by a work about Korea in my entire life. This was an incredible symposium. That's an amazing comment. Hope you hold on to that one. Special. I had a question about the final scene, the final shot on the spinning.
Right.
That was magnificent for me because, I mean, maybe I'm sort of overreaching, but I just interpreted it as this metaphor for the experience of this, machinery that is this world that's moving around you, and you're just trying to find your place and jumping up and landing and then jumping up and landing, and you're not moving it, but it's going on around you. And it just, I don't know, there was just so much, I can't even put it into words, but it just resonated with me that was like the best final shot. I don't know, what can you tell me what went into that?
It was one of those really sort of magical moments where we've been crying our eyes out, and the main character and we were just sort of driving around, and we were supposed to go back to the shelter. I had a small rental car, and sometimes we were allowed to go out. And then we went to this small fair, and it was sort of all closed down, and one of her friends were there with her, and it was like the sun was setting a little bit, and then they went on this fair, and then she just did that thing, and I was just I thought it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen her do, and it was so nice to see her sort of outside of the shelter as well, and just see her kind of have fun also. And I know that you might read a lot of things into that, like when I put it there in the end of the film, but it was just a really, really beautiful moment to see her have this special ability to be. I mean, it's a crazy thing to do. No, I mean, it's, yeah.
Here's another comment. It's from Lee So-hun. What a beautiful film. Thank you so much for making and sharing it. It really resonated with me as a Korean adoptee who was adopted to Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is a special audience for reaching Korean adoptees. And yeah, it's really interesting to see where the film is going, because yeah, it's yeah, it's just interesting. I'm really looking forward to sharing this in Sweden and the Netherlands and other places in Europe that I'm very connected to. But the big thing is right now also to go to Korea and screen it here in May, and hopefully I can get into the country. And I think we have the Minister of Health and Gender Equality to come and be at the screening, and the NCRC. So I think it's really, yeah, I really, that was my big wish, I think. It was really important, of course, to show it in Denmark, where I'm a citizen. But I kind of discovered that I had an urge to bring it to Korea, and that was a very deliberate thing, you know, that it had to be screened there. So I'm really looking forward to how it's going to be received, and I'm kind of nervous as well. Yeah, we're gonna have a screening with a lot of single parents, I hope.
We certainly have time for one more comment or a question. Anybody would like to?
Since you brought it up, Sunhee, the screening in Korea, I'm curious what you, I guess two things. One is what you hope will happen, especially considering the fact that there's been some challenges to the special adoption law recently. And secondly, and I think it came up in one of the comments, what difference it makes that these women are from Jeju Island, and whether you think that might be interpreted by Koreans in different parts of the country, particularly in Seoul.
So the women who came to the shelter, they came also from the mainland. So they were just sort of moving around a lot. So it's not a Jeju film per se, I think. I don't have so many expectations of how it's going to be received. I mean, on a personal note, I would really like for my mother to see it and my family, but I won't know if that happens. But that was sort of my personal goal. But the other thing is that I can't take it to a different level. I mean, I don't speak the language. I can sort of only give it and say, like, this is what I made with a big team, and now somebody else needs to do something if they want to change. But I mean, we've been working a lot with a lot of NGOs for single parents, and try to sort of connect all of the NGOs to work together on a statement. So there will be a public statement on the 11th of May. So it's a lot of, you know, trying to organize or help organize or initiate or invite people. I think there is a huge job in trying to find out what is happening with the people who are inter-country adopted in Korea and how the conditions are for them, because I think it's quite difficult and they're quite invisible. So I think that would be really interesting to work on the communication with that group. I have a personal longing because I've been working with the women so much, and during this process I was like, well, where are the men? Where is my father? And I think it's like a group that is just not existing in any academia. I can't find any studies on them. So I think it's really, really interesting to look at that group and see what happened to them. So I'm gonna try and pursue that, I think.
There's one question from an attendee asking if the women have seen the film.
Yes, they have all received links. I have gone there every year since I stopped making. I mean, we did the post-production, so I've been returning and showing clips, and we've been gathering, and so.
And what were their reactions? The questioner is asking.
I mean, they could recognize themselves and a very tough period in their life. I mean, the toughest perhaps. And of course, there are going to be different reactions to that. But I think what I was for them was that I was a witness for the hardship that they went through. And maybe that was the finest job that I could do for them. I could witness and be there with them in that very difficult time. But I don't know how it feels like. I mean, I can imagine, but having given birth to a baby and then nobody around you want to recognize that. And I know that I have a special bond with them, and they allowed me into that space at that time. And I trust that a lot. And there was maybe a very small window where they could fight. And then that closed down. And they had to do different things to be able to move on, and not be completely detached from their families or society or education. And I respect that too. But it's just not black and white.
Yeah. Well, I hate to end the symposium, but we have to. I am so grateful for the audience, for the participants, for the great work of Ariel and Shruti and Jean, for making sure that this symposium went off without a hitch. And of course, thanks to the George Washington Institute for Korean Studies and the Academy for Korean Studies. I just couldn't have imagined this would go so well. I'm so pleased, and it's just been fantastic listening to all of you and such great questions from the attendees. Please stay in touch with the Institute for Korean Studies and attend our other events and tell people about our events. We certainly want to keep growing and keep staying on everybody's radar. So I wish you all a lovely weekend. And I know it's very late now for you, Sunhee in Denmark, 6 hours ahead. So I wish you a good night. And many thanks, and take care, everybody. Stay safe.